Hello, and welcome to ML's Audiobooks. This channel is dedicated to filling in any of the gaps in the available audiobook forms of Marxist literature, and I hope you find this resource useful. Thank you. Today, I will be reading The Right of Nations to Self-Determination by Vladmir Ilyich Lenin. Originally published in 1914 and sourced from Lenin's collected works, published by Progress Publishers in 1972, Volume 20, pages 393 to 454. As posted on Marxists.org. Chapter 5. The Liberal Bourgeoisie and the Socialist Opportunists in the National Question. We have seen that the following argument is one of Rosa Luxemburg's, quote, trump cards, unquote, in Lie's struggle against the program of the Marxists in Russia. Recognition of the right to self-determination is tantamount to supporting the bourgeois nationalism of the oppressed nations. On the other hand, she says, if we take this right to mean no more than combating all violence against other nations, there is no need for a special clause in the program, for Social Democrats are, in general, opposed to all national oppression and inequality. The first argument, as Kautsky irrefutably proved nearly 20 years ago, is a case of blaming other people for one's own nationalism. In her fear of the nationalism of the bourgeoisie of oppressed nations, Rosa Luxemburg is actually playing into the hands of the Black Hundred nationalism of the Great Russians. Her second argument is actually a timid evasion of the question whether or not recognition of national equality includes recognition of the right to succession. If it does, then Rosa Luxemburg admits that, in principle, Section 9 of our program is correct. If it does not, then she does not recognize national equality. Shuffling and evasions will not help matters here. However, the best way to test these and all similar arguments is to study the attitude of the various classes of society towards this question. For the Marxist, this test is obligatory. We must proceed from what is objective. We must examine the relations between the classes on this point. In failing to do so, Rosa Luxemburg is guilty of those very sins of metaphysics, abstractions, platitudes, and sweeping statements, etc., of which she vainly tries to accuse her opponents. We are discussing the program of the Marxists in Russia, i.e., of the Marxists of all the nationalities in Russia. Should we not examine the position of the ruling classes of Russia? The position of the, quote, bureaucracy, unquote, beginning parentheses, we beg pardon for this inaccurate term, end parentheses, and of the feudal landlords of our united nobility type is well known. They definitely reject both the equality of nationalities and the right to self-determination. Theirs is the old motto of the days of serfdom, autocracy, orthodoxy, and the national essence, the last term applying only to the great Russian nation. Even the Ukrainians are declared to be a, quote, alien, unquote, people, and their very language is being suppressed. Let us glance at the Russian bourgeoisie, which was, quote, called upon, unquote, to take part, a very modest part, it is true, but nevertheless some part, in the government, under the, quote, June 3rd, unquote, legislative and administrative system. It will not need many words to prove that the Octobrists are following the rights in this question. Unfortunately, some Marxists pay much less attention to the stand of the great Russian liberal bourgeoisie, the progressists, and the cadets. Yet he who fails to study that stand and give it careful thought will inevitably flounder in abstractions and groundless statements in discussing the question of the right of nations to self-determination. Skilled though it is in the art of diplomatically evading direct answers to, quote, unpleasant, unquote, questions, REC, the principal organ of the Constitutional Democratic Party, was compelled, in its controversy with Pravda last year, to make certain valuable admissions. The trouble started over the All-Ukraine Students' Congress held in Lvov in the summer of 1913. Mr. Mogilyansky, the, quote, Ukrainian expert, unquote, or Ukrainian correspondent of REC, wrote an article in which he poured vitriolic abuse, beginning parentheses, quote, ravings, unquote, quote, adventurism, unquote, etc., end parentheses, on the idea that the Ukraine should secede, an idea which Dontsov, a nationalist socialist, had advocated and the above-mentioned Congress approved. While in no way identifying itself with Mr. Dontsov, and declaring explicitly that he was a nationalist socialist and that many Ukrainian Marxists did not agree with him, Rabovchaya Pravda stated that the tone of Rek, or rather the way it formulated the question in principle, was improper and reprehensible for a great Russian Democrat, or for anyone desiring to pass as a Democrat. Let Rek repudiate the Dontsovs if it likes, but, from the standpoint of principle, a great Russian organ of democracy, which it claims to be, cannot be oblivious of the freedom to secede, the right to secede. A few months later, Rek, number 331, published a, quote, explanation, unquote, from Mr. Mogilyansky, who had learned from the Ukrainian newspaper Shilaki, published in Lvov, of Mr. Dontsov's reply, which, incidentally, Dontsov stated that the, quote, the chauvinist attacks in Rek have been properly sullied, in brackets, branded, end bracket, only in the Russian social democratic press, end quote. This, quote, explanation, unquote, consisted of the thrice repeated statement that, quote, criticism of Mr. Dontsov's recipes, unquote, quote, has nothing in common with the repudiation of the right of nations to self-determination, unquote. Beginning of block quote. Quote, it must be said, unquote, wrote Mr. Mogilyansky, quote, that even the right of nations to self-determination is not a fetish, in brackets, mark this, end bracket, beyond criticism. Unwholesome conditions in the life of nations may give rise to unwholesome tendencies in national self-determination, and the fact that these are brought to light does not mean that the right of nations to self-determination has been rejected. End of quote and end of block quote. As you see, this liberal's talk of a, quote, fetish, unquote, was quite in keeping with Rosa Luxemburg's. It was obvious that Mr. Mogilyansky was trying to evade a direct reply to the question whether or not he recognized the right to political self-determination, i.e. to secession. The newspaper Proletskaya Pravda, in issue number 4 for December 11, 1913, also put this question point blank to Mr. Mogilyansky and to the Constitutional Democratic Party. Thereupon, Rek, number 340, published an unsigned, i.e. official, editorial statement replying to this question. This reply boils down to the following 3 points. 1. Section 11 of the Constitutional Democratic Party's program speaks bluntly, precisely, and clearly of the, quote, right of nations to free cultural self-determination, unquote. 2. Rek affirms that the Proletskaya Pravda, quote, hopelessly confuses, unquote, self-determination with separatism, with the secession of a given nation. 3. Quote, actually, the cadets have never pledged themselves to advocate the right of nations to secede from the Russian state, unquote. Beginning parentheses, see the article, quote, national liberalism and the right of nations to self-determination, unquote, in Proletskaya Pravda, number 12, December 20th, 1913, end parentheses. Let us first consider the second point in the Rek statement. How strikingly it shows to the Semkovskys, Liebmans, Yurkoviches, and other opportunists that the hue and cry they have raised about the alleged, quote, vagueness, unquote, or, quote, indefiniteness, unquote, of the term, quote, self-determination, unquote, is in fact, i.e., from the standpoint of the objective class relationships and the class struggle in Russia, simply a rehash of the liberal monarchist bourgeoisie's utterances. Proletarskaya Pravda put the following 3 questions to the enlightened, quote, constitutional democratic, unquote, gentlemen of Rek. 1. Do they deny that, throughout the entire history of international democracy, and especially since the middle of the 19th century, self-determination of nations has been understood to mean precisely political self-determination, the right to form an independent national state? 2. Do they deny that the well-known resolution adopted by the International Socialist Congress in London in 1896 has the same meaning? And 3. Do they deny that Plekhanov, in writing about self-determination as far back as 1902, meant precisely political self-determination? When Proletskaya Pravda posed these 3 questions, the cadets fell silent. Not a word did they utter in reply, for they had nothing to say. They had to admit tacitly that the Proletskaya Pravda was absolutely right. The liberals' outcries that the term, quote, self-determination, unquote, is vague, and that the Social Democrats, quote, hopelessly confuse, unquote, it with separatism are nothing more than attempts to confuse the issue and evade recognition of a universally established democratic principle. If the Semkovskys, Liebmans, and Yurkoviches were not so ignorant, they would be ashamed to address the workers in a liberal vein. But to proceed. Prolitskaya Pravda compelled Rek to admit that, in the program of the Constitutional Democrats, the term, quote, cultural, unquote, self-determination means, in effect, the repudiation of political self-determination. Quote, actually, the cadets have never pledged themselves to advocate the right of nations to secede from the Russian state, unquote. It was not without reason that the Prolitskaya Pravda recommended to Novoye Vremya and Zemshina these words from Rek as an example of our cadets' quote, loyalty, unquote. In its issue number 13563, Novoye Vremya, which never, of course, misses an opportunity of mentioning, quote, the Yids, unquote, and taking digs at the cadets, nevertheless stated, quote, what, to the Social Democrats, is an axiom of political wisdom, beginning brackets, i.e., recognition of the right of nations to self-determination, to secede, end bracket, is today beginning to cause disagreement even among the cadets, end quote. By declaring that they, quote, have never pledged themselves to advocate the right of nations to secede from the Russian state, unquote, the cadets have, in principle, taken exactly the same stand as Novoye Vremya. This is precisely one of the fundamentals of cadet national liberalism, of their kinship with the Purishkeviches, and of their dependence, political, ideological, and practical, on the latter. Prolitskaya Pravda wrote, quote, the cadets have studied history and know only too well what, to put it mildly, pogrom-like actions the practice of the ancient right of the Purishkeviches to grab them and hold them has often led to, unquote. Although perfectly aware of the feudalist source and the nature of the Purishkeviches' omnipotence, the cadets are, nevertheless, taking their stand on the basis of the relationships and frontiers created by that very class. Knowing full well that there is much in the relationships and frontiers created or fixed by this class that is un-European and anti-European, beginning parentheses, we would say Asiatic if this did not sound undeservedly slighting to the Japanese and Chinese, end parentheses, the cadets, nevertheless, accept them as the utmost limit. Thus, they are adjusting themselves to the Purishkeviches, cringing to them, fearing to jeopardize their position, protecting them from the people's movement, from the democracy. As Prolitskaya Pravda wrote, quote, in effect, this means adapting oneself to the interests of the feudal-minded landlords and to the worst nationalist prejudices of the dominant nation, instead of systematically combating those prejudices, end quote. Being men who are familiar with history and claim to be Democrats, the cadets do not even attempt to assert that the democratic movement, which is today characteristic of both Eastern Europe and Asia, and is striving to change both on the model of the civilized capitalist countries, is bound to leave intact the boundaries fixed by the feudal epoch, the epoch of the omnipotence of the Purishkeviches and the disenfranchisement of wide strata of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. The fact that the question raised in the controversy between Prolitskaya Pravda and Rek was not merely a literary question, but one that involved a real political issue of the day, was proved, among other things, by the last conference of the Constitutional Democratic Party held on March 23rd to 25th, 1914. In the official report of this conference in Rek, number 83 of March 26, 1914, we read, quote, a particularly lively discussion also took place on national problems. The Kiev deputies, who were supported by N.V. Nekrasov and A.M. Kolyubakin, pointed out that the national question was becoming a key issue, which would have to be faced up more resolutely than hitherto. F.F. Kokoshkin pointed out, however, in brackets, this, quote, however, unquote, is like Shredrin's, quote, but, unquote, quote, the ears never grow higher than the forehead, never, unquote, end bracket. That both the program and past political experience demanded that elastic formulas of political self-determination of nationalities should be handled very carefully, unquote. This most remarkable line of reasoning at the Cadet Conference deserves serious attention from all Marxists and all Democrats. Beginning parentheses, we will note in parentheses that Kievskaya Mizil, which is evidently very well informed and no doubt presents Mr. Kokoshkin's ideas correctly, added that, of course, as a warning to his opponents, he laid special stress on the danger of the, quote, disintegration, unquote, of the state, end parentheses. The official report, in Rec, is composed with consummate diplomatic skill designed to lift the veil as little as possible and to conceal as much as possible. Yet, in the main, what took place at the cadet conference is quite clear. The liberal bourgeois delegates, who were familiar with the state of affairs in Ukraine, and the quote, left unquote, cadets, raised the question precisely of the political self-determination of nations. Otherwise, there would have been no need for Mr. Kokoschkin to urge that this quote, formula should be quote, handled carefully, unquote. The cadet program, which was of course known to the delegates at the cadet conference, speaks of quote, cultural, unquote, not of political self-determination. Hence, Mr. Kokoschkin was defending the program against the Ukrainian delegates and against the left cadets. He was defending, quote, cultural, unquote, self-determination as opposed to, quote, political, unquote, self-determination. It is perfectly clear that in opposing, quote, political, unquote, self-determination, in playing up the danger of the, quote, disintegration of the state, unquote, and in calling the formula, quote, political self-determination, unquote, a, quote, elastic, unquote, one, beginning parentheses, quite in keeping with Rosa Luxemburg, unquote, Mr. Kokoschkin was defending great Russian national liberalism against the more, quote, left, unquote, or more democratic elements of the Constitutional Democratic Party and also against the Ukrainian bourgeoisie. Mr. Kokoschkin won the day at the cadet conference, as is evident from the treacherous little word, quote, however, quote, in the Rec report. Great Russian national liberalism has triumphed among the cadets. Will not this victory help to clear the minds of those misguided individuals among the Marxists in Russia who, like the cadets, have also begun to fear the, quote, elastic formulas of political self-determination of nationalities, unquote? Let us, quote, however, unquote, examine the substance of Mr. Kokoschkin's line of thought. By referring to the, quote, past political experience, unquote, beginning parentheses, i.e., evidently the experience of 1905, when the great Russian bourgeoisie took alarm for its national privileges and scared the cadet party with its fears, end parentheses, and also by playing up the danger of the, quote, disintegration of the state, unquote, Mr. Kokoschkin showed that he understood perfectly well that the political self-determination can mean nothing else but the right to secede and form an independent national state. The question is, how should Mr. Kokoschkin's fears be appraised in the light of democracy in general and the proletarian class struggle in particular? Mr. Kokoschkin would have us believe that the recognition of the right to secession increases the danger of the, quote, disintegration of the state, unquote. This is the viewpoint of Constable Mimretsov, whose motto was, quote, grab 'em and hold 'em, unquote. From the viewpoint of democracy in general, the very opposite is the case. Recognition of the right to secession reduces the danger of the, quote, disintegration of the state, unquote. Mr. Kokoschkin argues exactly like the nationalists do. At their last Congress, they attacked the Ukrainian, quote, Mazepists, unquote. The Ukrainian movement, Mr. Savenko and co., exclaimed, threatens to weaken the ties between the Ukraine and Russia, since Austrian Ukrainophilism is strengthening the Ukrainians' ties with Austria. It remains unexplained why Russia cannot try to, quote, strengthen, unquote, her ties with the Ukrainians through the same method that the Savenkos blame Austria for using, i.e., by granting the Ukrainians freedom to use their own language, self-government, and an autonomous diet. The arguments of the Savenkos and Kokoschkins are exactly alike, and from the purely logical point of view, they are equally ridiculous and absurd. Is it not clear that the more liberty the Ukrainian nationality enjoys in any particular country, the stronger its ties with that country will be? One would think that this truism could not be disputed without totally abandoning all the premises of democracy. Can there be greater freedom of nationality as such than the freedom to secede, the freedom to form an independent national state? To clear up this question, which has been so confused by the liberals, beginning parentheses, and those who are so misguided as to echo them, end parentheses, we shall cite a very simple example. Let us take the question of divorce. In her article, Rosa Luxemburg writes that the centralized democratic state, while conceding autonomy to its constituent parts, should retain the most important branches of legislation, including legislation on divorce, under the jurisdiction of the central parliament. The concern that the central authority of the democratic state should retain the power to allow divorce can be readily understood. The reactionaries are opposed to the freedom of divorce. They say that it must be, quote, handled carefully, unquote, and loudly declare that it means the, quote, disintegration of the family, unquote. The Democrats, however, believe that the reactionaries are hypocrites, and that they are actually defending the omnipotence of the police and the bureaucracy, the privileges of one of the sexes, and the worst kind of oppression of women. They believe that in actual fact, the freedom of divorce will not cause the, quote, disintegration, unquote, of family ties, but, on the contrary, will strengthen them on a democratic basis, which is the only possible and durable basis in civilized society. To accuse those who support freedom of self-determination, i.e., freedom to secede, of encouraging separatism, is as foolish and hypocritical as accusing those who advocate freedom of divorce of encouraging the destruction of family ties. Just as in bourgeois society, the defenders of privilege and corruption, on which bourgeois marriage rests, oppose freedom of divorce, so, in the capitalist state, repudiation of the right to self-determination, i.e., the right of nations to secede, means nothing more than a defense of the privileges of the dominant nation and police methods of administration, to the detriment of democratic methods. No doubt, the political chicanery arising from all of the relationships existing in capitalist society sometimes leads members of parliament and journalists to indulge in frivolous and even nonsensical twaddle about one or another nation seceding. But only reactionaries can allow themselves to be frightened, beginning parentheses, or pretend to be frightened, end parentheses, by such talk. Those who stand by democratic principles, i.e., who insist that questions of state be decided by the mass of the population, know very well that there is a, quote, tremendous distance, unquote, between what the politicians prate about and what the people decide. From their daily experience, the masses know perfectly well the value of geographical and economic ties and the advantages of a big market and a big state. They will, therefore, resort to secession only when national oppression and national friction make joint life absolutely intolerable and hinder any and all economic intercourse. In that case, the interests of capitalist development and of the freedom of the class struggle will be best served by secession. Thus, from whatever angle we approach Mr. Kokoschkin's arguments, they prove to be the height of absurdity and a mockery of the principles of democracy. And yet there is a modicum of logic in these arguments, the logic of the class interests of the great Russian bourgeoisie. Like most members of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Mr. Kokoschkin is a lackey of the money bags of that bourgeoisie. He defends its privileges in general, and its state privileges in particular. He defends them hand in hand and shoulder to shoulder with the Purishkevich, the only difference being that the Purishkevich puts more faith in the feudalist cudgel, while Kokoschkin and co. realized that this cudgel was badly damaged in 1905 and rely more on bourgeois methods of fooling the masses, such as frightening the petty bourgeoisie and the peasants with the specter of the, quote, disintegration of the state, unquote, and deluding them with phrases about blending, quote, people's freedom, unquote, with historical tradition, etc. The liberals' hostility to the principle of political self-determination of nations can have one and only one real class meaning: national liberalism, defense of the state privileges of the great Russian bourgeoisie, and the opportunists among the Marxists in Russia, who today, under the 3rd of June regime, are against the right of nations to self-determination. The liquidator Semkovsky, the Bundist Liebman, the Ukrainian petty bourgeois Yurkovich are actually following in the wake of the national liberals and corrupting the working class with national liberal ideas. The interests of the working class and of its struggle against capitalism demand complete solidarity and the closest unity of the workers of all nations. They demand resistance to the nationalist policy of the bourgeoisie of every nationality. Hence, social democrats would be deviating from proletarian policy and subordinating the workers to the policy of the bourgeoisie if they were to repudiate the right of nations to self-determination, i.e., the right of an oppressed nation to secede, or if they were to support all the national demands of the bourgeoisie of oppressed nations. It makes no difference to the hired worker whether he is exploited chiefly by the great Russian bourgeoisie rather than the non-Russian bourgeoisie, or by the Polish bourgeoisie rather than the Jewish bourgeoisie, etc. The hired worker who has come to understand his class interests is equally indifferent to the state privileges of the great Russian capitalists and to the promises of the Polish or Ukrainian capitalists to set up an earthly paradise when they obtain state privileges. Capitalism is developing and will continue to develop anyway, both in integral states with a mixed population and in separate national states. In any case, the hired worker will be an object of exploitation. Successful struggle against exploitation requires that the proletariat be free of nationalism and be absolutely neutral, so to speak, in the fight for supremacy that is going on among the bourgeoisie of the various nations. If the proletariat of any one nation gives the slightest support to the privileges of its quote own unquote national bourgeoisie, that will inevitably rouse distrust among the proletariat of another nation. It will weaken the international class solidarity of the workers and divide them, to the delight of the bourgeoisie. Repudiation of the right to self-determination or to secession inevitably means, in practice, support for the privileges of the dominant nation. We will get even more striking confirmation of this if we take the concrete case of Norway's secession from Sweden. End of chapter.